Aloha, and thank you for joining us again for another one of our bicentennial speaker series. Can you believe it's already towards the end of February? The year has gone so fast, and in April, we will put a close to our 200th celebration. This week, we are just very pleased to have people from our neighbors right next door, the Hawaiian Mission Houses. And we have Elizabeth Po'oloa and Mike Smola, who will talk to us about the religious life and work of the early Abcfm, or the American Board of Commissioners for the Foreign Missions. Anyway, what they're going to be talking about is they're going to be sharing readings, artifacts, and stories about how the first missionaries and the early Native Hawaiian converts, how they shared the gospel with each other and lived their religious lives. According to a letter from Reverend Hiram Bingham, backdated from May 13th, 1820, Reverend Bingham chose as his first theme of his sermon, "Behold, I bring you good tidings." Now, this letter and others like it are housed in the Hawaiian Mission Houses Archives. By the way, if any of you are interested in visiting, they are open. One of the few things that are open right now, Tuesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. The hours vary, so we ask that you just go to their website, missionhouses.org. And even for those of you who are doing research in the archives, you can make appointments with them. Just a little bit about our speakers. Our first speaker will be Mike Smola, who is the Curator of Public Programs. He has a BA in History and a certificate in Museum Studies from Michigan State University. Aren't you glad you're living in Hawaii now? Cold over there. He's been at the Hawaiian Mission Houses Historic Site and Archives since 2008. And previously, he was part of the education staff at the Turner Dodge House in Lansing, Michigan. He is a member of the Association of Living History Farms and Agricultural Museums since 2011, serving on their board of directors from 2016 to 2019. Our second speaker today will be Elizabeth Po'oloa, who is an executive team member and director of operations and collections. She has a master's degree in the history of art and architecture and a certificate in museum studies from the Arts and Administration program at the University of Oregon. She was curator of collections at the Hawaiian Mission Houses, or has been since 2016, with expanded roles to include site facilities, and she's part of their executive leadership team right now. From 2012 to 2016, she served as the lending collection manager at the Honolulu Museum of Art, where she curated and cared for more than 5,000 to 6,000 artifacts and also 6,000 two-dimensional art reproductions that were on loan for educators within the state of Hawaii. She's also a former board member of the Hawaiian Museums Association. So we are very pleased to have it. So right now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, which is Mike Smola. And I also want to remind everyone, if you have questions that come up during the presentation, to please make sure to add them into our chat, because afterwards we will have a live Q&A chat session with both of our speakers. So thank you again for tuning in. And here we go on our next speaker series. Thank you, Mike.
All right. Thank you, Auntie. All right. As you may know, Kawaiahao Church and Hawaiian Mission Houses have a shared history. We both have our roots in the Sandwich Islands Mission, founded in 1820 by the missionaries of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or the Abcfm. In 1853, the children of some of those first missionaries founded the Hawaiian Mission Children's Society, or HMCS, to maintain relationships between them and to raise money for additional mission work throughout the Pacific Islands. With Kawaiahao continuing to do the religious work of the original missionaries, over the years, HMCS became a genealogical society and the repository for the history of the Abcfm missionaries, including their personal writings, manuscripts, letters, journals, and material culture. The name of our organization is still officially the Hawaiian Mission Children's Society, but over the years we have become known as Mission Houses Museum, which reflected the organization's connection with the site and history, and then more recently, Hawaiian Mission Houses Historic Site and Archives. This is a long name, but it reflects the broader scope of activities and the impact the organization has on our community. Today, Hawaiian Mission Houses preserves and shares the history of the original mission and 19th century life in Hawaii. Among many treasures on site are the 1821 Mission House, the oldest Western-style still-standing house in all of Hawaii, the newly finished Halepili o na Mikanele, and the library and the archives, which includes holdings in both English and Hawaiian, including over 80,000 digital pieces and one of the largest collections of Hawaiian language books in the world. Today, we'll be presenting various primary sources from our library collection and permanent object collection, including the historic site itself, that inform us about the introduction of Christian worship here in Hawaii in the early 19th century. Now, the scope of our presentation will cover the very early period from 1820 with the arrival of the Thaddeus and the voyage over, and the arrival of the second company in 1823. All right. So, what I put together is some of the journal entries and some of the letters and things that reflect different aspects of worship by groups and individuals on board the Thaddeus here in Hawaii. So I'd like to start off with On Board the Brig Thaddeus. And this is taken from Sybil Bingham's journal. This dates from November 28th, 1819. In the morning at 10, our mission family met in the cabin for social conference. At 12, assembled on deck when all belonging to the vessel were present to attend divine service. A canopy put up to shield us from the sun. The water is tranquil and serene. Mr. Bingham, was enabled to address us from the Word of God. A double blessing did it seem to me to be permitted under such circumstances to hear divine truth and to hear from that dear friend who had these many days languished under much bodily weakness. He had with him this evening conversation of a most interesting nature, relative to scenes which may be before us. The subject was tender. By frequently taking such a view of our future path, may we be at once led to the infinite fountain of divine support for provision for the hour of trial. One of the reasons I chose this one in particular to start off with was it looks at group worship within the missionaries, within the mission family itself, and also their worship with other people, i.e. the crew of the ship on board the Thaddeus. And I thought it was interesting that they had different social meetings or social conference related to religion, as well as having public worship as well. So this is kind of the basic setup they have on board the Thaddeus. All right. Also on board the Thaddeus, we have Lucy Thurston's memoirs, and this entry is from December 20th, 1819. The image we have on here is actually the handwritten manuscript of her memoirs that are in the HMCS library and archives. And what this one says, we have family devotions in the cabin morning and evening, Sabbath forenoon, a religious service in the cabin, and at noon, when the weather allows, public worship on deck. The monthly concert of prayer is observed. The interesting situation in which we are placed, separated from the Christian world and engaged in such a work, renders this a season doubly precious and animating. So, I mean, on Sabbath days, there is a whole progression of services amongst themselves, as well as the public worship on deck. Now, I do want to make a quick comment about the monthly concert of prayer. This is not a music concert, all right? It was a common practice in New England that once a month, basically, a special worship service was held to support very particular causes. It might be mission work in other parts of the world, or for a specific local purpose or something like that. So this was basically just a special church service with a very, very specific purpose to it. Now, thanks to the archives here and the journals, we also have what a worship service might have looked like on board the Thaddeus. This one comes from the Sandwich Island Mission Journal, and this was a journal kept by multiple members of the mission, mostly the male members, and this was sort of the official diary of the mission itself. And this is from October 31st, 1819. So at this point, they are about 8 days out from Boston. All right. October 31st, 1819, Sabbath. Today we are permitted to enjoy the privilege of the public worship of God at 12 o'clock. The mission family and the ship's company assembled on the quarterdeck and attended divine service conducted by Brother Thurston. Singing, prayer, sermon, prayer, benediction. The discourse on the nature of prayer and the motives to its performance from James chapter 4, verse 3 was seasonable and refreshing. All right? And the image we have here is also from our archival collection. That's Reverend Asa Thurston and his wife Lucy. This picture was taken in the 1860s. All right. So that order of service might seem very familiar to you folks out there, as it's still the basic blueprint of most Protestant services in much of the world. Right. Now, in addition to these sort of social or group worship, as well as public worship, amongst other folks, we also have quite a bit of evidence for personal worship or devotions, as well as the type of schedule that the missionaries sort of held themselves to during their days when it was not the Sabbath. And so, again, these two entries are both taken from Sybil Bingham's journal. The image you see here is the famous portrait of Reverend Hiram Bingham and his wife Sybil, painted by Samuel F.B. Morse before they left Boston in October of 1819. So the first entry is from Sybil Bingham's journal, is November 19th, 1819. Enjoyed this morning upon awaking a tender and solemn season in united supplication with my dearest friend, Mr. Bingham, in which his soul seemed melted and his spirit bowed down in view of the awful responsibility of his station. Went from our little family room to the family altar, around which in the morning we had not before been permitted to assemble. There seemed some meltings of heart, with several which I trust has been the case through the day. So there you have an example that they set up a family altar, as well as the Binghams just themselves having a personal worship or devotional period for themselves as a family, as a couple. Now, the missionaries tried to keep themselves busy while they're on their way over here. And a good example of sort of the personal work ethic of the missionaries, as well as what they did when it was not the Sabbath on board the Thaddeus. This entry comes from Sybil's journal again, January 25th, 1820. I must go to my work. A regular system has been strenuously recommended to all. It is variously regarded. I will give you some parts of mine. It commences with the hour 6 in the morning, closing with 10 evening. From 9 to 12, logic and theological reading. From 12 to 1, recitation of my class. 1 to 2, dinner and exercise. 2 to 6, miscellaneous reading, writing, and Oahu language. So at this point, they're already learning the Hawaiian language. And from 6 to 8, tea, singing, social intercourse, and exercise. And so they kept themselves a fairly regular and, if I might say, a bit of a rigorous personal schedule. They weren't just lazing about the ship, so to speak. All right. Now, once they arrive here, we want to get in the sense of what they continued doing from their time aboard the Thaddeus and what they did actually at our site across the street here. So this is the first reading I have here is also from Sybil Bingham's journal, October 3rd, 1822. At this point, they had been living inside the 1821 mission house for about a year and 3 months. All right. And the picture you have here is the 1821 mission house parlor. That's a modern photo. All right. But I think it's really important that they set this room aside for some very specific purposes. And the journal entry says, one of the 5 rooms was considered as necessary for common resort, for conversation, for the discussion of language, to receive company, which was often calling, and to attend morning and evening prayer, etc. So even after they got here, they are holding morning and evening prayer sessions for the members of the mission inside the house, and they're doing it inside the parlor, which was also used as a reception room and a meeting room, so to speak, especially for newly arrived missionaries and ali'i that would come and visit the house quite frequently. All right. And now, related to one of the other items on our site here is our newly reconstructed Halepili Ona Mikanele. This is from the Sandwich Islands Mission Journal, December 28th, 1820. At this point, the missionaries are still living in the Halepili on the grounds. And it says, this evening we have enjoyed family religious conference. Our family now consists of 25 souls at this place. So they are still, so even in the Halepili, they're still engaging in family religious discussions and devotional service, devotional practices, as well as worship services. Now, one of the other interesting things that many of the missionaries comment upon are the participation of Hawaiians in worship service, especially very early on. And so the image you see on this slide is the Queen at Waimea. This is an engraving from 1826, also in our archival collection. And this comes again from the Sandwich Island Mission Journal, the official journal that was sent back to Boston in pieces to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. February 17th, 1822, Sabbath. Brother Bingham, preached to an interesting assembly, principally natives, from the last address of Jesus to his disciples, as recorded by the 3 last verses of Matthew's Gospel. Thomas Hopu, one of the 4 Hawaiians who came back here with the first group of missionaries, having had the manuscript a week and given much of his attention to it during that time, had written a translation, which enabled him with peculiar freedom and force to interpret it as it was delivered. In the afternoon, they went to Waititi, or Waikiki, and preached the same sermon. There at the house of Tamari'i, or Kamwali'i, and Ka'ahumanu, and their group, Tamari'i has been several days sick. He requested Brother Bingham expressly to pray for him that his weakness might be healed, and when the request was complied with, he expressed his gratitude as though he considered himself to be really obliged. So this journal entry, there's a lot of things going on in this journal entry. First, you have the normal assembly, the normal service on Sunday morning. And there, it's really interesting that, especially even as late as 1822, this early part of 1822, that the missionaries are still very much dependent upon their interpreters and translators. In this case, Thomas Hopu. And by giving the sermon to Hopu a week ahead of time, I think it really shows this partnership between the Hawaiians who are involved with the church, as well as the missionaries themselves, the ordained reverends. And that I think it's also interesting to note that as Bingham is giving the sermon, it is being sort of what we might call simulcasted today in Hawaiian by Hopu. And as he says, with peculiar freedom and force. So apparently Hopu could be quite the preacher when he needed to be. All right. But I also think it's very interesting to show that at this point in 1822, when none of the ali'i had been baptized yet, that Kamwali'i, who had been sick, requests prayer and is really thankful for the opportunity to engage in that practice over his sickness. Now, one of the other subdivisions I came up with putting this together was requesting prayer, and something that I think doesn't get spoken to enough, which was the role of missionary women and the role of women in the church. In the first image I have here is a modern picture of the Bingham bedroom in the 1821 mission house as we interpret it today. And this particularly applies to the first reading here. This is also from the Sandwich Island Mission Journal, September 19th, 1822. Naihe and Kapiolani, his wife, came in the morning to the house and spent with us most of the day. They desired to attend prayers in Brother B's or Brother Bingham's bedroom. They brought with them Kepokulo, a priest of Kamehameha who formerly resided at Kealakekua. He was over the uncle of Opukahaia, with whom Opukahaia lived and who knew Opukahaia before he went to America. He confirms the statement made by Opukahaia that his parents were killed in battle. So this also shows this not only shows that they came to the mission house and engaged in personal devotion and personal worship and prayer, but also that it's very interesting that there's this connection between the Hawaiians who are coming for this practice and pre-arrival the missionaries, and in particular the life of Opukahaia, which of course inspired these missionaries to come here to Hawaii in the first place. Now, to the other part, this comes from Lucy Thurston's memoirs. This is a entry from 1822. And one of the things that, like I said, doesn't really get talked about that much is the role of the missionary women, as well as the church work that they were doing. And so I find this one particularly interesting, because this is one of the earliest examples of missionary women leading some type of devotional practice amongst Native Hawaiian women. So this is from 1822. A female Friday meeting commenced. Mrs. Bishop and myself acted in concert. We conceived the idea of endeavoring to lift our female population by meeting with them every Friday in the afternoon. We were each to sustain this responsibility of the thing by alternately presiding at the meetings. For many months, they have been attended. At first, I think there was not an individual who had learned to say, "Our Father." Now they can lead in prayer with great propriety and think it a great privilege. With great freedom and seriousness, too, they express their religious convictions. We read to them a portion of Scripture. The Bible leaves in the Hawaiian language have been very scarce. Once I was driven to extremity, being obliged to take the first chapter of Matthew, the only portion remaining. That was the way they rehearsed the names of their own kings and preserved them by simply retaining them in their memory. And I think this also speaks to the propensity of Hawaiians to memorize large sections of the Bible. Many of the missionaries comment on this quite frequently in their personal journals. And this is just one way they go about it. They would read it and then recite it back, many times to the missionary themselves. Now, in addition to missionary-led worship, of course, Hawaiian converts engaged in independent worship and devotion amongst themselves as well. And here I have a couple of examples. The image you see on the slide here is the fourth Kawaiahao Church, the one before the building we're in today. And this is a drawing by Clarissa Armstrong. All right. So the first entry I have is Lauren Andrews' journal from April 1st, 1828. Tuesday. Another ship was towed part of the way inshore. Through the carelessness of a drunken pilot, she hit on the reef and hung for 2 or 3 hours and was considerably injured. About 11 o'clock commenced at another, but wind sprang up and prevented it. Packed up my things as well as I was able. 4 o'clock afternoon, went ashore. Welcomed by missionaries. On the way from the landing place to Mr. Bingham's, we passed the meeting house and graveyard, natives there holding a prayer meeting. Okay. So basically between our site and the church here, Lauren Andrews, when he gets off the ship here, this is the arrival of the third company, notices that there's a group of Native Hawaiians holding a prayer meeting sort of in the space between the graveyard and the 1821 mission house. So what would be today basically the middle of Mission Lane, of Kawaiahao Street, sort of right on the corner with Mission Lane there. Right? Now, I also wanted to introduce some sources other than the missionaries themselves from their journals and letters. And luckily, in our archives, we hold a collection of ali'i letters, and which, through a project a few years ago with Avaya Foundation and Dr. Puakea Nogelmeyer, we were able to digitize, translate, and do typescripts both in Hawaiian and in English, which are up on our website as well. And so what we have here is a letter from James Kahuhu from 1826. Now, James Kahuhu was one of 2 Native Hawaiians, the other one being John Papa'i'i, who were put under the instruction of Reverend Asa Thurston at the arrival of the missionaries in Kailua Kona in 1820. And so this is a letter from Waipio here on Oahu, September 6, 1826. Greetings to you, Mr. Chamberlain, that's Levi Chamberlain. I am currently preaching to students, one lau of students, that's 400 students, and one additional kanaha, 40, along with 27, so 467 people he's preaching to. Here is my message to you. I am striving on my own. I preach to students and to those who are seeking some portion of God's word, which I have acquired. That which I have attained from all of you is what I am teaching to the students. I have sought no other text. The word of God is what I preach to them. The will of our Lord is what I do. I maintain his love in my heart and his patience with me while preaching of God's will. I repent my breaking of God's law. I love him. May we gain salvation through Jesus. James Kuhuhu. And so that's powerful that even at this, again, 1826 is still a little bit later on from the very, very beginning of the mission. But very quickly, the people who had received religious instruction began preaching themselves and spreading the word of Jesus and the church amongst their country people already, independent of what the missionaries were doing themselves. Now, of course, I also managed to find evidence of Hawaiian personal worship and devotion, not just group things like James Kuhuhu preaching or the prayer meeting held right in between our two sites right here. The first one I have is from the Sandwich Islands Mission Journal on September 10th, 1822. During the absence of the king, Kamamalu has lodged in the walls of the fort, where she has uniformly had morning and evening prayers, usually accompanied by a hymn also, in her own language. As she is about to sail to the windward to join the king, Naihe, who will be left as superintendent pro tem, engages to have family prayers continued as well. And the picture we have here is also from our archives, and it's a drawing of the old Honolulu fort, for which Fort Street downtown here is named. So we have Kamamalu, one of the queens of Liholiho, engaging in private devotion within her home, and we have direct evidence of that. The last one, this other one, I think is much later. This letter comes from 1843 from our letters collection, but I think it also gives a set to how far Hawaii and Hawaiians had come in their faith within the first 23 years of the mission. This is a letter from Ke Kuanaoa, dated January 2nd, 1843. Greetings to you, Cook, and all the children of ours. So he's writing a letter to Amos Cook, who is at this point still at the Chief's Children's School. Do extend loving regards to Victoria Kamamalu. I received your letter with fond thoughts of you two and the children of ours. And I agree with your words. I am praying to God amid this sadness and trouble when I find a moment of respite. I pray cordially to God, letting my thoughts rely upon him, the one who blesses us. And when the pain is great, I then pray to God amid the sadness and distress. I always praise God, who helps those always place their trust in him. And I ask that we all strive together through continual prayer to God on my own behalf, on behalf of all the children of ours, and for the king and prime minister, and for all the chiefs and people, that we may all be blessed on the day that our Lord is beheld. May we all be blessed by the love of our Lord Jesus Christ, Ke Kuanaoa. Now, what's interesting, what's going on around this period is the incident in 1843 with Captain Paulette and the British takeover of the islands in 1843. And he's writing to Amos Cook, who is the kahu and the kumu at the Chief's Children's School. And Victoria Kamamalu at that time was a young student there. So I think this really shows how much faith played a role in not only Ke Kuanaoa's personal life, but also in the role that he felt it had in regards to public worship and in Christianity's role in the nation as well. Now, one of the other interesting things that we found that I found evidence of in going through the journals and such were sort of practices of worship and some of the things regarding church membership and practices. So the first one I have is from the Sandwich Islands Mission Journal, and it's an infant baptism. of Levi S. Loomis, whose image you see on the slide there. All right, and so this is December 31st, 1820. At this point, the missionaries had been here approximately 8 months. This morning, after a sermon by Brother Bingham from John chapter 3, verse 5, on being born of water and of the Spirit, the infant daughter of brother and sister B, Sophia Mosley, and the infant son of brother and sister Loomis were publicly and solemnly dedicated to Christ by baptism into the name of the Holy Trinity, ministered by Brother Thurston. Brother Loomis's babe, the first white child born in the Sandwich Islands, they called Levi, the name of the first tribe of men consecrated to the priest's office. It was a pleasant and solemn season, and our house was filled with more than ordinary numbers who seemed more than ordinarily attentive, and those who were peculiarly interested as parents, enjoyed a peculiar privilege of setting the reel of God's gracious covenant on their beloved offspring in this public dedication. So there we have evidence that the missionaries were doing infant baptism, even though they also believed that you had to have an adult baptism, all right, that you had to make an adult conscious decision to follow Christ and to become a participating member of the church. Now, the other one I found interesting is the practice of communion. And this one we have two entries, both from the Sandwich Islands Mission Journal. The first one, December 29th, 1820. Lecture this evening by Brother Thurston, preparatory to the communion. All right. And so I find that one very interesting, that there was a lecture to prepare people for communion. And then the practice of communion itself on January 13th, 1822. Sermon in the morning by Brother Thurston. In the afternoon, we were refreshed by the communion of the Lord's Supper in commemoration of his dying love. Now, another interesting aspect of how people became church members during this time was the po'aha meetings. These were sort of a Sabbath school catechism sort of class to teach not only the Bible, but also about church doctrine and what it would take to become a church member. And this was sort of a precursor to baptism. This was the classes to teach you about the church and the teachings of the Bible, so that you can prepare to become for an adult baptism, become an official member of the church. And this was and what we find in the Elite Letters collection is that there's quite a collection of letters there that are recommending specific people to these po'aha meetings. So you had to be recommended to these meetings for church membership. And this is a letter from Kei Kuanaoa. Greetings to you, Mr. Chamberlain. I tell you of these men and women of Waimanalo to join the po'aha. I have approved of them. Here are their names: Nauhai, Kapalu, Kalima, Haulele, Puia, Pahiole, Hua Halai, Kane Wahine, Muemue, Nahea Wainaya, Keakale, Kaivi Ka'aula, Wahine Ho, Limahele, Kahavalu, Alue, Kealai. All right, and this is an undated letter from Matthew, Kei Kuanaoa. Now, Sabbath schools were also a very common practice amongst the mission and the early converts of Hawaii. And so to give you an idea of what these Sabbath schools, these Sunday schools were like, we have Sybil Bingham's journal entry from right around March 4th, 1821. There's no official date on this particular entry, but sandwiched in between March 4th, March 3rd, and March 5th in the journal. About 30 natives were present and listened with profound attention, with scarcely the exception of a child. This afternoon, 32 came, and as last Lord's Day to Sabbath school. Mr. Bingham read in Opukahaia, endeavoring to impress upon their minds some plain, simple truths. Thomas Hopu interpreted. The school was closed by joining with Honoli'i in prayer in his native tongue. Who could behold the great Jehovah, his holy name, addressed in a language they understood? So here we not only have a Sabbath school being interpreted by Thomas Hopu, but we also have Reverend Bingham using the story of another Native Hawaiian, Opukaha'ia, to talk about the truths of his religion and the truths of the religion that people were coming to. And I also find it interesting that there were not just one interpreter, but two, with Thomas Hopu and John Honoli'i. But John Honoli'i giving an extemporaneous prayer of his own volition and in his own language. So even before these missionaries learned Hawaiian themselves, they were bringing extemporaneous prayers conducted in the Hawaiian language here. The other one is I have from the Sandwich Islands Mission Journal about 2 months later. Full meeting, Brother T, Brother Thurston preached from 2 Corinthians 5:17. Our Sabbath school is weekly becoming more interesting. Some portion of Scripture is usually read and interpreted, after which they recite in concert their lessons, composed mostly of passages of Scripture translated into their own tongue. The school closes with prayer, either in English or Oahu, or Hawaiian. So that's how the schools were generally run, and sort of the order of the school, if you will. All right. And then, now this one I find interesting. I find this is probably the one for me that I found the most interesting. In 1822, a group of Tahitian Christian missionaries came here courtesy of the London Missionary Society. And these Tahitians have been playing a very critical role in the early years of this mission. By helping the missionaries learn Hawaiian, sharing their printed material in Tahitian with these missionaries, because it was a lot easier to try to translate from Tahitian to Hawaiian than English to Hawaiian. And they helped really pave the way for some early good relations between the missionaries and the Hawaiian ali'i. But this was a sermon, a discourse from Reverend Tyerman, who is one of the London Missionary Society reverends who had come here with Reverend William Ellis and a number of Tahitian Christians. And that he gives us sort of an account of how worship and what the state of religion is Tahiti. And he's obviously using this as an example of how Hawaiians, the mission here, and how the Hawaiian nation as a whole should really begin to address worship and their religious life. And this is from the Sandwich Islands Mission Journal, April 21st, 1822, the Sabbath. We were favored in the morning with a discourse from the Reverend Mr. Tyerman, in which he gave a general account of the state of things as they now exist in the Society Isles in Tahiti. Churches and schools are established throughout the island. Good, wholesome laws are promulgated, the Sabbath observed. They meet regularly 3 times on that day, once at the rising of the sun for the purpose of prayer, conducted by natives, and once in the forenoon and once in the afternoon for public service, when the missionaries preach to them in the language of the islands. Family prayer is a thing convivial, and it is supposed that no individual except very small children live without secret or private devotion. In the afternoon of this day, the Reverend Mr. Ellis preached to his little congregation in the Tahitian language. It was truly gratifying to hear them sing the songs of Zion in their own language. And as you can tell from some of the other journal entries about how church services were done and people preaching at certain times, this was certainly a model that the missionaries began adopting as well. In addition to this being expounded upon as an example for Native Hawaiians themselves, and how to conduct their religious life as a group, and as a nation, and as an individual as well. So thanks very much for listening to this. At this point, I'd like to bring up Elizabeth Po'oloa. Mahalo.
Aloha. Thank you, Mike, for all of that information. It's always, as we were saying, it's always interesting to read a lot of this material with new eyes, and we're honored to be here today at the Kawaihaʻo Speaker Series to talk about a very rich history of early worship in the early arrival period of the Abcfm missionaries. I'm going to follow up Mike's thoughts with some examples of how the material culture, and particularly the architecture at our historic site, also reveals more about the Christian lifestyle of the newly arrived first company of missionaries in 1820. When the missionaries arrived, advance the slide. There we go. When the missionaries arrived in 1820, their first housing was halepili. The traditional grass houses were the most common style of architecture in 19th century Honolulu. There were actually, this is a lesser known fact, there were some Western style buildings that existed at the time of their arrival, built from stone or from prefabricated lumber packages that had been ordered, but none of them stand today. None of those pre-existing houses still stand today, which makes the 1821 construction of the frame house on the mission site the oldest Western-style, still existing structure in Hawaii. Before the construction of the 1821 house, Governor Boki, who was much like a director of public works for Honolulu at the time, began constructing halepili for the missionaries about 3 months after their arrival upon the order of King Liholiho. This image that we see on the screen is the mission compound that was built by Governor Boki, and it became known as Missionary Row. It stood approximately in the front yards of what is now Mission Houses through Kawaihao Plaza on King Street, so if you can imagine that space. There were three, you can see in this pencil sketch by Dexter Chamberlain was made in October of 1820, that there are 3 houses that are connected by a long lanai, and then there's a tiny little building that's scarce in the foreground there. It's labeled number 6. It was a cooking house. So these three halepili connected by the long sort of shared space lanai, and then a storage house off to the side, which is labeled number 4. And then in the corner there, number 5, which is another lodging house. And the number 1 there is the Bingham's Hale. Then the number 2 is the Loomises. And number 3 was for the Chamberlain family, the Daniel Chamberlain family. Okay. To add more context to Mike's journal entries and letters which describe the worship practices, it's interesting to also think about the interior spaces in which these practices were taking place. In particular, because worship was an interior space enterprise, as the missionaries were bringing that practice with them, as their weather mainly informed that much of their worship practices need to be held indoors, coming from New England. In Hawaii, this was not part of the existing tradition upon their arrival. And so there was some reconciliation of practicing worship and the creation of interior space for this purpose. And so we start to see right off the bat some of our archival records talking about creating this interior space for worship. And one of the Bingham's, one of the hale that we just looked at in the picture of Missionary Row was the Bingham's hale was to be used as a schoolroom and a meeting house for church. It's interesting to also remember that assembling in large groups inside was not part of the existing Hawaiian tradition. This was much more of a Western construct and ideology that they were bringing with them. And so, you start to see the evidence of reconciling these ideas in the description of the space, which we have from the Thaddeus Journal at an entry from September 16th, 1820. The design of this first interior worship space is here. Mr. Ruggles and Captain Chamberlain fitted up the schoolroom for school and meetings or church services, hanging the wall and covering the ground with mats and making commodious seats. We felt the need of lumber, an article most difficult to be obtained here. It would hardly be possible at any price to purchase a sufficient quantity of plank for seats for this public room. Some of the timber brought with us will answer very well for temporary seats, placed around in the room double and covered with hay and mats. So in this excerpt and in this drawing that we have by George Holmes from 1821, we can see the reconciliation of the space, the expectations of church and worship as it was brought by the Abcfm missionaries, and how it drove inventions of perceived necessity by creating a hybrid worship space, worship and assembly space in combination with actually the Bingham's sleeping space as well inside of a hale pili. You may have noticed that South King Street has gotten a new addition into its landscape. And on our historic site, we recently gained a new building, which is the Hale Pili Ona Mikanele. The hale is located roughly in the same area as described, that missionary row once stood, and it is a reminder that although the Western-style buildings became more and more dominant into the 19th century, the hale pili was the dominant style of architecture at the time. And not only this, but also gives a visceral and tangible experience of what it would have been like to assemble for worship inside a space like this, as we talk about it in comparison to the Western-style architecture that started to develop into the 19th century. This hale that we recently finished is designed using Reverend William and Clarissa Richards' extensive descriptions of their own hale from 1823, although it does reflect the earlier construction from 1820 as well. We encourage you to visit the new hale building and get a sense of what it would have been like to congregate for worship inside a space like this. We do know that it was not typical to have windows or doors, as the missionaries had requested for their hale pili. So we do have a good example of what it would have been like. They described that they really just cut out windows in the sides of their thatch to provide themselves something that they were familiar with in their own architectural style. The missionaries, as discussed, the missionaries brought with them the belief that worship and learning was best conducted indoors, and it was that was part of their culture, bringing with them. And also, they began to be generally uncomfortable living in the hale pili. They had a prefabricated house shipped from New England, and it was described in the Sandwich Islands Mission Journal in an entry from January 10th, 1821. Yesterday and today, Captain Turner landed the frame of boards of our house sent from Boston, for the freight of which the owners make no account, while they generously confer on us the most important temporal favor. To fit up a room for school and public worship with comfortable seats, we bought today of Captain Burner and Captain Suter 1,000 feet of boards and plank at $50, their market price. So as time progresses, the missionaries know that they need a style of architecture, or they would like a style of architecture that reflects a bit more of the style of worship that they're accustomed to. And this is something that informs the decision to bring the prefabricated 1821 house to Honolulu. So in this way, we really can look at the two pieces of architecture together, the hale pili and the 1821 house, as our earliest artifacts of interior space worship in Hawaii in the early 19th century. The building of the house met with many challenges, but it was completed in August of 1821, so we're coming up on the bicentennial of the actual finishing of the 1821 house, which is very exciting for us at Hawaiian Mission Houses. I find this description of the king's reaction to the house particularly interesting. From May, it was almost finished, from May 17th, 1821. A visit from the king and some others of the royal family. We told him that we should always be friends of the king and his people, and that Our only object was to do him and his people good. He is much pleased with our house and wishes to send to America to get him 3 stories. He intends, he says, to worship Jehovah, and 1 story to be appropriated to that object. We hope that our friends and patrons feel disposed to furnish such a habitation for the king and for the mission. He seems to be desirous for such a place for the worship of God. So this to me is more to the point that while the missionaries were spreading the word and the gospel in the months before the 1821 house was finished, then not only was the interest striking the ali'i to engage in worship, but also in the lifestyle, the Christian lifestyle, and the mode of architecture that this lifestyle came with. And so, the king then also wanting a house and wanting to devote an entire level of the house. As Mike pointed out, the room of common purpose being a meeting place and a place for fellowship and worship. And this was something that was seemed to the king a good space for himself to have. As we get a little farther into time, then we start to see the development of the grass churches as well, the large grass churches which preceded this one that we stand in today. As talking about that large indoor assemblies of people were not common in Hawaiian tradition, so the need for a very large building was actually relatively unknown at the time. So it was not until the introduction of Christianity by the Congregationalists from New England that any grass house designer, any halepili designer, was faced with a problem of creating an auditorium. So Governor Boki supervised the construction of the series of the great grass churches that preceded this one. And one of them was said to be 196 feet by 73 feet, and also big enough to hold thousands. And it also had features like windows and wooden doors and even hanging lamps, which were not common aspects of halepili design. So in this way, we can see that the mission compound, including Kawehao Church, the development of the grass churches for Kawehao, was really a ground zero of ideologies coming together for architecture and Congregationalist worship in Hawaii. As the message of the word began to spread throughout Hawaii, so was the interest in creating these worship spaces. And so we can now look at our buildings here in downtown Honolulu as in that context, and understand them as the artifacts of this time of radical change here in Honolulu. So I hope that this also inspires a visit down to Hawaiian Mission Houses to come take a look at these spaces and the ways that they were used with all of this knowledge that we now have and descriptions from the primary resources. To see the architecture in person or to line up a virtual learning tool for yourself or your classroom, you can please visit our website, Hawaiian Mission Houses, missionhouses.org. Quite a bit of I wanted to bring up too that quite a bit of the material that you've seen in this presentation is digitized and available through our online collections, which you can access through our website. And for example, we've got a lot of our images in our negative collection that you've seen in the slides, Lucy Thurston's manuscript, memoirs, the Ruggles Journal. The Ali'i Letters Project was actually a combination of letters from multiple collections throughout the island, and they are digitized, transcribed, and on our website and available. Even more can be accessed through a research appointment, such as the Sandwich Islands Mission Journal and the Thaddeus Journal, by emailing archives@missionhouses.org. This presentation and much of our activities over the next 2 years at HMH focus on bicentennial commemorations of the arrival of the Abcfm missionaries and their early endeavors. The bicentennial role will continue through the next few years as we continue to look forward to focusing on the 200th anniversary of the first print pulled at the Halepa'i Sandwich Islands Mission Press in 1822, the arrival of the Tahitian missionaries to Hawaii that Mike briefly touched on, and the second arrival of Abcfm missionaries, and other events that had large impact on the overall development of worship and Christianity here in Hawaii. So with that, on behalf of everybody at Hawaiian Mission Houses, we are so thankful to be here with our neighbors and to share in this knowledge together. And we thank you for having us and look forward to answering more of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike and Elizabeth. I know it's a little hard taping in front of a non-existent audience, but thank you very much. For those of you who are in the audience, I know I was jotting down a few questions as we went along. So please feel free to put them in the chat and join us as we do our live chat Q&A, question and answer time at this time. Again, we thank you for joining us. And again, the disclaimer, in case of technical difficulties, we ask that you just extend grace to us just in case all of the technology doesn't work. At this time, I just also want to remind you that next month, which will be in March, we're going to be talking about the women of Kauai Ha'o Seminary, which is also very relevant to our history and to our going forward. And we just hope that through these series of bicentennial speakers that you've been able to gain different perspectives of not only life in old Hawaii, but just the wonderful work that continues to go on 200 years later. Just remember, we're just a speck in all of this. So again, thank you again. And now I believe we're going to be cutting away to our live presentation and our panel. Thank you again. Mahalo and aloha. And I want to thank everyone who is still on the broadcast with our on our live feed here. So anyway, I did jot down a couple of questions, but before I even get started on my questions, there was a question that was typed in very early in the presentation, and I suppose it's because everybody, you are the okay, Naholo, I think you have to put me on mute. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so I'm double screen there. Okay, so thanks, Naholo. The question was, Mark Twain came to Hawaii in the 1860s, and he wanted to know if the Mission Houses has any writing memoirs about him in Hawaii. I mean, we know that he was here, but we're just wondering if any of those of his writings made it into your archives. So, I mean, it's not a church question, but it's certainly a question we're all dying to know if you folks know of anything. So Mike or Elizabeth, do you know?
Well, I did see the question as it was being asked. So I did a little bit of sleuthing in the meantime, and I looked, and the first place that I go is the online catalog for Hawaiian Mission Houses whenever I have a question like this. And while I do see that we have several copies of letters from Hawaii, and we have a few images, really cool images in our negatives collection, I don't see any of the original manuscripts or microfilm of the original manuscripts in our collection. So I think, unless Mike, you know of any original writings that made it into HNCS.
No, that's the same. I went to the same place. I went to the online catalog, and we have 25 items according to the print to the screen here. But there are seem to be some very early editions of Mark Twain that were published in our collections. I'm looking at one following the Equator Journey Around the World that was published in 1897 in Connecticut, for example. But we don't seem to have anything written in his own hand, I guess would be the way to put it.
So then my next question is, do you have to be a member to log into your online catalog, or is that just open and available to the public?
Open and available. It is absolutely free and accessible to anyone with an internet connection.
Wow. So we can just look up anything and oh, wow, okay.
Absolutely.
I did not know that. That is pretty cool.
Yeah, so it's using our missionhouses.org website, and then you can, under library, you'll see the options for digital collections, and that will actually show you things that are original manuscripts that have been digitized, and you can see the originals there online. Or there's the online catalog that's like the new and improved old card catalog. So it should have everything that we have in the library. You will be able to search the titles.
Wow, that's an amazing resource. And I knew you had that, but I never knew that it was just open and to the general public. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add to that, Haunani, is that there, right on the front page of the library website, there are several tutorials about how to search and how to use the various features of that web page.
I'm going to have to check it out.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if anybody else in our panel has questions just yet. I know I don't want to just hog the entire question and answer period, but I did have one more question while we're waiting, or I don't know if Kay or Malia, you can raise your hand. These are members of our bicentennial committee. But Mike, this question is for you, because in your presentation, you had that the ali'is would come by and sit in the parlor and they would come by and visit. Now, was this, I mean, you know, it's, how often did the ali'i come in and just walk in and like, hey, Reverend Bingham, how you doing today? I mean, was it a in and out, open door kind of policy? I mean, for an ali'i, or it's like a head of state, or it's like the president of the United States or something, just walking into your living room and going, hey, you know, how you doing today? I mean, can you give me a little bit more insight into that portion? I found that to be very intriguing, that the ali'i would come and visit often, was I think your comment.
Quite. Yeah. I actually did a whole research project on that a few years ago. And they seem to be coming by quite frequently. Some of them once a week or more than once a week. We know that Queen Ka'ahumanu, for example, would actually stay in the house at times, the 1821 house. And so, especially when they first get there and when they're in the Hale Pili and when they first move into the 1821 mission house, they do seem to be able to stop by. And certainly being the rank that they were and sort of the head of state, I think it really behooved the missionaries, and they certainly felt so, to have a more open door policy, if you will, to folks like the various ali'i that would come by. And so they did quite frequently. There's one story I remember where Sybil Bingham sees Queen Ka'ahumanu coming up the road towards the house, and she's like, and she's kind of worried about, oh my gosh, I have to entertain and all this stuff, and she kind of goes, oh, like, do I really want to deal with that? And then she thinks better of it and goes and puts tea on for the queen and her retinue, and starts pulling out stuff for the table. So that kind of gives you a sense, I think, through that sort of little illustrative story about how frequently there's, gosh, I have to entertain them again, kind of thing.
Okay. Let me see here. I have a question from Bill Haoli. He has typed it in. Would you be able to expound a little more on the daily activities of our missionary friends beyond prayer and worship time? For example, daily living activities.
Do you want to take that, Elizabeth, or do you want me to take a stab at it?
Well, we both have some things to say about this one. We do a lot of interpretation of daily life on the mission compound at Hawaiian Mission Houses, particularly for the keiki that come through now virtually, but they're still getting the education about what it was like to live in the 19th century and we provide that immersive history experience. So the missionaries were really busy. They had a lot to do other than Bible study. And I think that the excerpt that Mike shared about how busy their life on the ship was gives a good example of what their different tasks throughout the day were. You know, that they had they were scheduled from sunrise until after sunset. They had you know, a lot of setting up house and getting to various locations. I think a lot of time was spent getting to and from various locations to preach. So that that took up a large part of the day. They would the women in particular had a lot of a variety of things that they were engaged in, and particularly the domestic arts, and trying to engage in those similar activities that they were bringing from New England, such as sewing and quilting, and also learning from their new neighbors as well. So it was a lot of social time and entertaining, and just general sort of life on the farm, just basically establishing their compound. You know, a lot of if anyone has lived on a ranch or a farm, you know how much work every day, taking care of animals and making food and making sure that the 25 people that you live with are fed. And yeah, so anything else, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of activities that are going on. Of course, the reverends are you know, trying to they're developing their sermons and trying to do at least some ad hoc translation work. They're also you know, many times meeting with the Ali'i or requesting things of the Ali'i. A very common one was for the missionaries to ask for passage to another island, to another nation. Or I was just reading right around this early time period, there was even talk of sending a group of these missionaries to Tahiti, and sending them off to go scout mission places in other parts of the Pacific, even very early on. And so, and then with the women and the Native Hawaiians they hired to work at the mission compound, there's a lot of the domestic tasks. You know, you got your things that we do every day. You got your washing the dishes and, you know, laundering clothes and making sure everyone's fed and cleaning up from that. In addition to people just popping by, there's a lot of things like that where a ship captain just came by and says, I have a sick crew member and I have nowhere else to put them, but we need to sail. So can they stay here? Kind of thing. And then they have to end up playing nursemaid to that person, and that kind of thing. So these, both the men, the missionary men and women were very, very busy throughout the day. They constantly, in their letters back to New England, talked to, hey, I have just a few minutes before I go to bed here. It's now like 10 o'clock at night. And I'm writing this by basically candlelight or lamplight. So it was a very busy, and in addition to that, there's people working around the grounds and people stopping by for instruction, and they're hosting schools on the grounds. So there's a lot of stuff going on all the time, every day, pretty much. Yeah.
And I think that the way that it exists today, where it sort of looks like a sleepy little museum on King Street, is not representative of what it would have been like in the 19th century. It was a hopping place. There was a lot going on. There were people coming through there, you know, and people wanting to stay and sleep. They were we even have a room interpreted as an orphan's room, or basically a room that was just kept so children that were passing through would have a place to sleep. And so, you know, that gives the example of that there were just beds available because there were that many people that that may or may not sleep there that night.
The rooms are full at the inn, as they would say. And I never thought about it, about traveling to and from. I mean, you know, we think that, oh yeah, we'll just go to church today, but they had their parishes, I guess, or Apana churches everywhere. I just never thought about the transit time back and forth. So that's interesting. Now I know Keiko has a question, and then after that, I have two other questions from the audience. Go ahead, Keiko, you can be next.
So Beth and Mike, thank you so much. the interesting thing is that we've come 200 years and we still have a lot to learn, because a lot of that is encased in your archival collections. And I'd like to say that I've been a user of your Mission Houses site, and so, but there's many things that are still to be translated or to be digitized, or else we'd have to go in person. And one of the things that you mentioned was about the establishment of HMCS, the Hawaiian Mission Children's Society, in 1853, and then sponsoring the Pacific Islands missions. And I understand that going forward that you are going to be, at least the mission houses, are going to be taking the letters or the collection of journals from the missionaries that went to the Pacific Islands, digitize them as well as translate them if they're in Hawaiian. Would that be something that we could look forward to in the next year or so, to have that project finished? And then the next thing I have to ask is the insight into the coming of the Tahitians. And I find it very interesting and exciting because we always talk about the collaboration between the Hawaiians and the missionaries in terms of Christian worship and the spread of the gospel. And we know very little about the influence and the impact that the Tahitians had in them coming here, especially Reverend Ellis, in the translation of the Bible to Hawaiian. So I find it all enriching, and maybe both of you can shed some light on that. Thank you.
I can take the first part of the question, Mike, and you maybe could take the second one. So I believe, Keiko, the project that you are referring to is the work that were for the Hawaiian Evangelical Association papers and the establishment of the Pacific Island missions from the Hawaiian Evangelical Association, and in particular our Marquesas collection and the Micronesian collection that was part of a large grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services that we've been working on since actually 2018. And we got a second installment of this wonderful grant for Native Hawaiian Library Services from IMLS that will continue and take us through 2022. And so we have digitized the Marquesian collection and the Micronesian collection, and those will be going up online. We're not focusing on translating as much as we are transcribing. And those collections are not the focus of transcription at this time, though what we are building in general in the Hawaiian Evangelical Association project at Mission Houses is a metadata and informational system that places Olelo Hawaii at its center. So actually, if the resource is in Olelo Hawaii, you will be able to search via our site and pull up your resources in the language that the resource is written in its original language. So in that way, we're not actually trying to translate concepts that may or may not match. And you can actually search in the primary language of the document. So that is something that's going on behind the scenes for us with this library services grant. And so I think that we will have a larger update on that. That will be, we'll have more updates as they get farther into this part of the project. They'll have a lot more to say for themselves. So that, you know, there's a team that's working on this under the academic supervision of Dr. Noelani Arista, and also the expert archivists Carol Silva and Kanani Rapun. So they're over there supervising this project and doing a lot of really cool work on it. So you'll get to hear more about it.
Great. And to address your comments about the Tahitians, they did play a very important role in the early years of the Abcfm mission here. there are a little bit more resources than people think related to the Tahitians that came with Reverends Ellis and Tyerman and Bennett from the London Missionary Society, from the mission in Tahiti. For example, in the Hawaiian Journal of History, the Journal of Hawaiian History, there's put out by the Hawaiian Historical Society. There's several articles dealing with the Tahitians. One is the Journal of Tuketa. Another one is a section of journals related to Tute. And then there's another one dealing with, and I've also seen a memoir written by one of the Tahitians as well, but that came from a private collection. There's also Reverend Ellis's book, or a series of books, depending on how the modern publisher packages them, known collectively as Polynesian Researches. Sometimes they're all in one big volume. Sometimes it's divided up into 3 volumes. But there is one of those 3 volumes deals specifically with Hawaii and him going to Aotearoa, to going to New Zealand in his travels. So there's some resource there. There are some mentions of the Tahitians in the various missionary journals, because a couple of them did stay the rest of their lives here in Hawaii, and did not go back to Tahiti, and they became royal chaplains and religious advisors and teachers to several of the elite. So there's a little bit more out there about the Tahitians than people think. But one of the things that we're really trying to bring to the front is their importance to not only the missionaries but also to the elite, and bridging the two in a lot of ways by helping the missionaries learn Hawaiian through the similarities with the Tahitian language. They brought their printed material from Tahiti, which were much easier to translate into Hawaiian, and gave the missionaries a sense of how the London Missionary Society folks developed the Tahitian alphabet and what might apply to the Hawaiian alphabet that was at the time being developed. And also having Polynesians here, especially ones that were already Christian, really kind of provided a bridge between the two groups that really helped cement some early good relations between the Abcfm missionaries and the Hawaiian elite. So their importance, especially in these first couple of years here, really can't be understated. Can't be overstated. They were so important to the early missionary efforts. And more and more is coming to light. Just the other day, I was talking with somebody, and someone found a collection of letters from one of the Tahitians, and maybe even some journals. I'm still trying to get a word on what that is, but that's very exciting that someone's willing to come forward with that primary source material, and willing to share it with us at Hawaiian Mission Houses, and eventually, I'm sure, a lot of other folks.
Thank you. Now I have a kind of a funny household question. This is from Lisa Leong. Did the missionaries ever complain about how their clothing might not have fit the warm weather here in Hawaii? I mean, any documented things.
Right. What I have found in reading the journals and letters is they complain more about the climate and how, rather than the clothing that they're wearing. They do complain about how hot it is, how humid it is, how difficult that can make work for them on a daily basis. But they don't really comment on their clothing as the cause of their discomfort. I don't think they're thinking of it in that way. I haven't run across any specific thing related to them wanting to change their clothing, rather than try to change their interior environment to be more suitable to what they need to do on a daily basis.
The one thing clothing related that I can think of, and this is because my primary background is in material culture and museum collection. So I work with the hats and the hats that are in the collection at mission houses. And so I've seen records of the early, just the new climate and the new environment necessitating new styles of hats for them. So they needed wide brim woven hats, and that was something that they needed to go to their neighbors to ask for because they did not know how to weave. in the type of fiber that was available. They needed to learn, and they needed to or order from their neighbors wide brim. We have a lot of really beautiful examples of children's hats that are woven very intricately in lolu, and that are from the very early days for some of the earliest born children on the mission compound. And so if you can imagine being a fair-skinned woman and your child out there in the heat of Honolulu sun, when it was just dry, brush and dirt basically on the mission compound, you would want your child to have a pretty wide brim hat. So that is one climate and clothing thing I can think of.
Very interesting. Okay, we do have a couple more questions to go. I do have one more quick question about the oral histories. I believe, Mike, you had referenced, or I'm not sure who referenced it, but they were saying how you would just read from the book of Matthew, and then it was so matter of fact the way it was said that, well, they just remembered it like how they do with their ancestors, or how they mentioned it, that they just memorized it. I mean, I think that's something that should be really just brought out, because, or can you elaborate on that a little more? We all knew that, in Hawaiian culture anyway, I mean, as young children, you were required to learn the reign of your place. You had to know the phases of the moons by a certain age. You had to, all by memory. You had to know the winds, the rains, and you also had to know your mo'oku auhau, or your genealogy. I mean, so memorize, because we were in oral history, memorizing was just something that you just did. Now, can you elaborate on that anymore? Because also in our society, we know that there were those who were specifically, what do you call that now? Eidetic memories, of those who had those eidetic memories that could just go in and hear everything and then just repeat it all back, entire courtroom sessions and whatnot. So I was just wondering if you had any more in that one statement that you, or that one note that they had meant, that they just did like how they always do. They just memorized it.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, I found several journal entries and comments and letters over the years, and especially in relation to teaching school and how quickly the kids are memorizing things like the spelling book, for example, and their spelling lessons and things like that. Several of the missionaries comment about the capacity of Hawaiians to memorize incredibly large passages of scripture, sometimes a chapter or more all at once. And being able to repeat it back word for word to the missionary as the missionary is reading along. And so there's lots of comments of that kind of thing. And I think that extension of the oral traditions of Hawaiian culture into print education, if you will. I think that the respect that type of education and memorization had in Hawaiian society really carried over into the print era, and moving forward into more Western modes of schooling and things like that. But that basic practice, it was still being practiced. It was still being trained. People were still being trained to do that, and applying that to this new learning situation, to this new technology of writing and literacy. And so there's lots of comments in the letters related to memorization of incredibly long passages, and sometimes and memorizing whole lesson books and things like that.
Oh, okay. So we're maybe put that in as a subject for a whole nother time for us to do. I mean, that just sounds fascinating. And along that same line of school and whatnot, Malia, why don't you go next, and then I'll get to another question that Bill had.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask a little bit about the adobe house. So you spoke about the buildings that were on, what we're familiar with as the Mission House property now. But we know that the adobe house that is on Kaiahao Church's property, but it was the original meeting house or something, correct? And so I guess I'm just also trying to understand how it was used in conjunction to the compound of buildings that were all part of what made up that mission site. And Elizabeth, you had mentioned that, you know, those, and I've never seen that image before of the 4 pili hale that made up the various homes. But then I was interested that when you were describing about how the missionaries, you know, somehow felt that everything had to happen indoors. And so you were saying that the Bingham house had to be used as a place of worship and education. So then I was like, okay, but where are they living? If the, you know, because, you know, when you look at the pili hale that you folks have just had reconstructed or newly constructed, but to represent that style of home and building on your property, you know, it's not a very big space. I've been in those spaces before. So I'm just trying to envision how it's all happening at the same time. And I don't recall the actual date of the adobe house, but it's my understanding that that also is a very, very old building. It certainly predates the current structure of the church sanctuary itself.
Yeah, it's a great question how that building fits into the evolution of the compound. And because we had so much material to go through, we focused on that super early period. Otherwise, you know, we would get into a little bit more, too much to bite off. But I do love the history of the adobe house, and Mike, you can help me out a little bit, but I want to say it was built maybe 10 years after the arrival, and then Sybil Bingham was teaching in the adobe house, and so that was, you know, that she was teaching in her halepili, and then eventually teaching in the frame house, I believe, and then moved into the adobe house. So that is a rough structure of the evolution of Sybil Bingham teaching in those 3 structures.
Yeah, it was built about 1830, 1831. And the thing I really like about the adobe schoolhouse is that inside the walls of the structure there is some of the original adobe, actually. I've seen it behind one of the bookcases. There's a little cabinet front that you can pull off, and there's some of the original adobe in there, in between the modern walls. So that's really neat, kind of from a preservation aspect, that they were able to do that. Also, the adobe school building was also used during general meeting, as I understand it as well, for when they would have like committee meetings or committees of the whole, for the body of missionaries getting together and, you know, going over their previous year's work and planning out the next year's work with all the different missionaries. So when they talk about general meeting, and they talk about going to the meeting house, that's one of the places they met, was the adobe building as well, in addition to the meeting house being the church as well. But we do have archival evidence that shows that they did use both buildings as part of their general annual meeting as well.
You know, we have so many stories. You know, we can do probably a whole another session on the adobe schoolhouse. We can do a whole another section about the oral histories. We know we still have the missionary letters to go on. And then Bill had a question. Bill's question is another one that we could probably spend a whole subject on. So just if you want to do a brief answer, and it's probably something that we're going to look towards the future as we start putting some of these things together. But Bill's question is, if you can share any stories, especially about the printing press and Elisha Loomis, and the books that were printed, and the time it took to print out just, let's say, one book. I mean, as I know, this is a question that we can devote an entire session to. So we don't have the time for a complete thing, but if there's anything that you can share very briefly on that.
Right. So the very first printing was January 7th, 1822, and they printed the spelling book, the primer, Ka Pia Pa. And Ke'aomoku was the first one to pull the lever on that printing press there on January 7th. One interesting note about the primer is it's a virtual copy of Webster's Blue Black Speller from 1816, except in Olelo, Hawaii. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I'll share one of my favorite stories about the printing press and Elisha Loomis. One is he writes back to Boston asking for more printing supplies, for more type, and he says in his letter, "I need 4,000 A's and 3,000 K's to go so I can use the press. We don't need all these other letters. I need 4,000 A's and 3,000 K's." So in the meantime, what he did is he actually made wooden type and cut out some of the, like for a K, for example, he would take a capital R and cut off part of the loop at the top to make a lowercase K. Now, as the result of his request, it shows up about 6 months after he leaves the islands to go back to the continent. So that's just one favorite story I can share. Another one, books printed. They printed, of course, Bibles, but all types of literature and teaching books on everything from algebra to spelling to zoology. They were also printing, of course, newspapers, government laws and proclamations and things like that. Basically, any book you might need in a schoolhouse, that's what they were printing, more commonly than not. And the time it took to do a book, that could be variable depending upon the size of the book. For example, something like the Primer, they run off 500 copies of that in a day, and they get rid of them by 2 days later, kind of things. One of the things that they could not keep up on. Something much longer, like the Bible, for example, the 1838 first edition of the Hawaiian Bible was 2,331 pages long. So something like that, you would be printing batches of pages. That could take probably upwards of a month to put together, to fully print, bind, and publish a batch of Bibles, for example. So it really kind of depends on the type of stuff that they're printing. But they were printing much more than just religious works, I guess, is the kind of the point I want to make, especially in the school books. Realms, grammar books and things like that, all in Olelo, Hawaii, were being printed. So,
500 copies in a day? I mean, I thought, you would say like 10 or 20.
Oh no,
that's a lot. That's a lot of time.
That's a printing crew of 5 people, basically working dawn to dusk, from the moment you can see to the moment there's not enough light to print by. And it's a crew of 5 people who are operating a single printing press. So if you got, they were training Native Hawaiians to work the press very early on in the early to mid 1820s. There's mid 1820s. There's at least 3 Native Hawaiians we can identify by name that worked in the printing establishment on the grounds. And they talk about them doing the various jobs of printing as well. So.
Well, definitely, like I said, we have several topics, that we're going to have to circle back to. But I've written them all down: the Tahitian chaplains, the oral histories and memorization, now the printing press. So lots for us to still go. Technically, our series does end next month. For everyone that is still online with us, next month will be March 21st, and it's going to feature the women of Kauai Ha'o Seminary and how they were just a major influence just on everything till much later on. I mean, as we all know, women were very important in Hawaii's culture and history as opposed to Western culture. And so we have a wealth of information. Our speaker will be Tomiko Connor, or Coco Connor, for those of you who know her, and you'll be getting the message out. But right now, I think we're going to call it an evening. We'd like to thank again Hawaiian Mission Houses, especially to Mike Smola and Elizabeth Po'olua. Thank you, mahalo, for taking the time to be with us. I know I learned a lot today, especially about the archives. And again, I want to reiterate for those who want to go on, it's missionhouses.org.com. So thank you again. And at this time, we want to say mahalo and aloha, and especially to our operator, Naholova Granberg. And we'll see you next month. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. God bless, and have a great rest of the Sabbath day. Aloha.
Mahalo, everyone.
Aloha.